Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
Hi Reddit, my name is Nathan. I'm 28, and I've finally done something I've been dreaming about for most of my adult life. I bought the vintage car I've always wanted. Not just any car, a 1967 Mustang Fastback, cherry red, immaculately restored, and every detail exactly how I imagined it when I was a kid sketching muscle cars in my notebook. I saved for years, worked 2 jobs at times, and resisted spending a single extra penny on anything frivolous because this was my dream. I even turned down invitations, vacations, and new gadgets I wanted, all because I had a vision. This car, parked in my garage, ready to take me on the open road. But when I invited my family to come see it, I realized just how little they cared about my dreams. It started the morning I sent a group text. Hey, everyone, I finally bought the Mustang. I'd love for you to come see it today at 2 p.m. I'll have snacks, drinks, and a tour of the garage. I double-checked that the message went to everyone, my mom, dad, and my younger brother George. George has always been the star of the family. He's 10 years younger than me and somehow gets everything handed to him, money, attention, and praise, without even asking. I should have known this wouldn't end well. At 1:45, I was pacing in the garage, polishing the hood for the 10th time, feeling my excitement bubble with every reflection of sunlight off the chrome trim. By 2:15, no one had shown up, and I was starting to get that familiar knot in my stomach, the one I always get when my family prioritizes George over anything else. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was my mom. Her text read, "Nathan, we need to talk about the car." That was it. No congratulations. No, we're coming to see it. Just a vague, heavy-handed message that made my stomach churn. I stared at the Mustang, gripping the steering wheel, trying to tell myself not to take it personally, but it was impossible. George had a big soccer tournament that afternoon. Of course, the whole family was at the field, cheering him on, posting pictures on social media, and probably talking about his amazing goal last week, while I sat behind the wheel of a car I had dreamed about for years, completely alone. I kept thinking about all the little sacrifices I'd made just to reach this moment, and the way my family treated my accomplishment like it didn't matter. My dad would have been proud if I bought a new laptop or a fancy watch, but a car that mattered to me? That's just a toy, they'd say. I started to drive around the neighborhood, hoping the motion would calm my nerves, even if no one was here to share the moment. But the streets felt empty, the world quiet, and with every turn I realized just how often this had happened in my life. Family birthdays I spent quietly, achievements I downplayed because no one noticed, and milestones that got overshadowed by George's latest successes. I remembered the high school award ceremony where I'd won the science fair, and the only photo my mom took was blurry, focusing on George as he posed with his soccer trophy a few weeks later. It wasn't just disappointing, it was humiliating in the most subtle, insidious way. And then it hit me, the full weight of it. I wasn't just sad or frustrated. I was angry, and I realized that this pattern had followed me for decades. Every time I reached for something meaningful, my family's energy went to George. Every time I celebrated, it was small and quiet. George got fanfare, applause, and validation. I thought I'd outgrown caring what they thought, but seeing my dream car alone in my garage, waiting for people who had made it clear I wasn't worth their time, stung worse than I'd expected. I decided to text my mom back, trying to keep my cool, trying to be rational. "Hey Mom, I'm here in the garage. The car's ready for you to see anytime." I typed, hands shaking a little. No reply. Then my dad. "Dad, the car's done. Would love for you to come by." Nothing. Finally, I texted George, half expecting some smug response about his soccer game. "Hey George, Mom and Dad here." His reply was exactly what I anticipated. "Huh? They're watching me play. You'll have to see it another day." Another day. Of course, another day that would never come, because my family's attention span never extended past George. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the garage, polishing, adjusting, and just sitting behind the wheel, feeling an odd mix of pride and resentment. I loved the car. It was everything I had wanted, but the silence around me felt deafening. I remembered countless moments where I had bent over backward to support my family, to attend every little thing George did, to say good job, and mean it, even when it wasn't deserved. I realized something in that quiet. This was a turning point. I was done bending over backward. I was done trying to be seen by people who refused to see me. And I knew, even as I sat there, that my next step wasn't just going to be about enjoying the car. It was going to be about making them finally acknowledge me, one way or another. By evening, my garage lights reflected off the Mustang's cherry red paint, and I could almost feel the tension crackling through the house. I heard the door unlock, and my heart jumped, expecting maybe my mom or dad, or even George, to walk in. But no one appeared. Instead, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Mom. "Nathan, we need to talk. It's about the car. Come inside." My chest tightened. What could she possibly want to talk about now? Did she even realize she had ignored me all day? I wanted to snap, to yell, but a part of me knew this was exactly the moment that could shift everything. Something inside me said, "Don't give them the satisfaction just yet." I leaned back in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, and thought, it's time they saw what it's like to be left out for once. And then, I heard it, the sound of tires on the driveway. But it wasn't the sound I was expecting. I held my breath as the tires crunched against the gravel, my pulse hammering in my ears. I fully expected Mom or Dad to stride out, maybe finally apologetic, or even George bouncing down with a grin and a soccer ball tucked under his arm. But what appeared at the end of the driveway wasn't a family member. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Henley, walking her dog, giving me a cheerful wave and asking about the car. I forced a smile and waved back, my chest tightening as the realization hit. Nobody from my family was coming. Not now, not ever. By 7 p.m., the garage lights were glowing, illuminating every polished surface of my Mustang. But the place felt emptier than it had in the morning. I kept checking my phone. Nothing. No messages. No apologies. Nothing acknowledging the invitation I had sent hours ago. Just silence, except for those few cold, clipped texts from Mom, like she was deliberately keeping me waiting, testing me. And I realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't new. My entire life, my achievements had been background noise compared to George's antics. I remembered my 21st birthday, my graduation party, which I had begged my parents to let me host at home with a few close friends. I spent weeks preparing. I made a playlist, rented a photo booth, and even convinced a local food truck to park in our driveway. I imagined that night as a milestone, a moment where my family would finally see me for something beyond being George's older, boring brother. But what actually happened? Mom spent the whole night fussing over George's soccer schedule. Dad made a toast that only mentioned George's future, and George himself spent most of the party playing video games in the corner, while my friends tried to include him. My birthday faded into a blur of disappointment, and my family didn't even notice. Now, sitting behind the wheel of the car I had worked for years to buy, I realized how little had changed. The next morning, I tried again, hoping that maybe Mom would call instead of sending texts. I knew better than to expect Dad or George to acknowledge it. Dad had a way of smiling politely and moving on like nothing mattered. And George, well, George had always thrived on attention, not on caring about others. I texted, "Mom, can we please talk today? The car is here, and I'd like to share it with you before I take it for a drive." 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Finally, a reply. My chest lifted for a moment as I read it. "Nathan, we need to talk. Can you come inside?" I dropped my keys on the counter and marched into the house, adrenaline surging. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and a hint of George's cologne. I expected tension, maybe a little guilt from my mom. Instead, what I walked into made my stomach knot tighter than ever. The living room was filled with balloons and banners for George. One of them read, "Go George," in massive, glittery letters. I stopped in my tracks, heart sinking. Mom, Dad, and George were all sitting on the couch, grinning at each other, as if the universe had conspired to punish me. Mom stood and smiled at me, but there was no warmth. "Nathan, we wanted to celebrate George's big tournament today. Isn't that exciting?" she said, her tone sharp, dismissive, like I had interrupted something sacred. I opened my mouth, ready to argue, ready to tell her that I had invited them to see something that mattered to me, that I had worked my ass off to buy, and that I deserved their attention for 5 minutes. But no words came out. The room felt heavier with every passing second. Dad chimed in. "He's worked so hard this year. You know how important soccer is to him. I knew exactly how important it was. Important enough that my entire family treated his games as if they were national holidays. Important enough that they literally ignored my invitations, my achievements, and my milestones. My voice finally found me. I invited all of you to see something that matters to me, something I've been dreaming about for years. None of you came. You all went to George's game instead. George laughed, lounging back with a smug expression. Well, that's because my game is important. And, you can see the car another time. The casual cruelty of his tone hit me like a punch. I blinked, struggling to keep my anger in check. I realized something then. George wasn't just spoiled. He was trained to expect the world, and my family was complicit in reinforcing it. Mom, still smiling, moved closer. Nathan, it's not about ignoring you. We just think maybe you're overreacting. A car isn't a big deal compared to family milestones. You need to understand that. My hands clenched at my sides. I had spent months planning, saving, dreaming, and they treated my accomplishment like it was a minor inconvenience. My chest tightened, and a sharp, raw edge of betrayal cut through me. I turned to Dad, desperate for an ally. Dad, didn't you think it was worth celebrating? Even a little? I worked for years to buy that car. He leaned back, arms crossed, a patronizing look in his eyes. Nathan, I know you worked hard, but it's a car. A car is not a person. It's not a milestone. Stop being so dramatic. I felt my face heat, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like holding back. Not a milestone? Do you even hear yourselves? Every time George does something, anything, you throw a parade. You've ignored me my whole life. And now, when I finally do something I care about, you act like it's nothing. George, smirking, piped up again. Relax, big bro. It's just a car. You always make a big deal out of everything. The words were casual, but the venom was clear. My stomach churned. I realized something horrifying. They didn't see me as an equal. Not as a son, not as a brother, not as a person with dreams and desires. I was background noise, a permanent supporting role in George's story. Mom reached out, gently, though I saw the manipulation in her eyes. Nathan, don't be upset. Maybe you should be grateful we're trying to be reasonable. You know we love you. The last words felt like sandpaper on raw skin. Love, in their world, meant forcing me to be small so someone else could be big. I felt my breaking point building like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Everything I had suppressed, years of being overlooked, ignored, and dismissed, was surging up inside me, hot and sharp. I had always tried to be patient, rational, and polite, but sitting there, listening to them belittle my dream, I realized that patience had gotten me nowhere. I realized that being polite hadn't earned me recognition. It had earned me invisibility. And then it happened. My mom, in what I can only describe as a deliberate act of cruelty, leaned closer and said, Nathan, if you really cared about this car, maybe you should have bought it after George's tournament. We wouldn't have minded celebrating it then. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't just the car anymore. It was everything. Every birthday I spent quiet, every achievement I had to downplay, every milestone ignored because George needed the spotlight. And now, the cherry on top, they were trying to control when I could enjoy the thing I had worked my whole life for. My hands shook, my chest heaving, and I realized I couldn't stay calm. I turned and walked out of the house, leaving Mom, Dad, and George staring after me. I went back to the garage, slammed the door behind me, and sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, the car now feeling like both a trophy and a weapon. My thoughts raced. I had tried to be the bigger person, but the truth was obvious. My family had no respect for me, no regard for my dreams, and no intention of ever treating me fairly. And that's when I started thinking, if they wouldn't celebrate me, wouldn't acknowledge me, wouldn't even see me, maybe it was time they felt what it was like to be excluded, to be ignored, to realize, for once, that life could go on without bending over backward for George or their expectations. My mind churned with plans, strategies, and ideas, each one calmer and sharper than the last. For the first time, I felt in control, and the fire in my chest wasn't anger anymore. It was determination. I looked at the Mustang, its gleaming red paint reflecting my own face in the rearview mirror, and I whispered under my breath, They're about to find out what happens when Nathan finally stops waiting for permission to be happy. The next few days were a blur of frustration, disbelief, and a deep, aching loneliness. I spent hours in the garage, sometimes just staring at the Mustang, sometimes driving aimlessly around town, letting the engine roar drown out the thoughts hammering in my head. Every time I passed George's soccer field, my chest tightened, my stomach knotting with a mix of rage and sorrow. There he was, in his element, flanked by the whole family, laughing, smiling, receiving all the praise I had craved my entire life. I kept telling myself I shouldn't care, that this was my victory, my dream fulfilled, but the truth was harsher. I felt invisible, irrelevant, and trapped in a family that never seemed capable of seeing me as anything other than George's older, boring brother. I tried reaching out again. Texts to Mom asking if she'd like to see the car, calls to Dad attempting to make plans. They all went unanswered. Every day, I watched my notifications fill up with pictures of George, his soccer practice, his celebrations, his friends tagging him in posts about his achievements. And me? I had the car, yes, but no one to share it with, no acknowledgement, no genuine joy reflected back at me. At first, I tried rationalizing it. Maybe they were busy. Maybe George's tournament was really important. But deep down, I knew better. They were prioritizing him over me in ways that were deliberate, ingrained, and relentless. By midweek, I hit a breaking point. I was sitting in the driveway, the sun slanting in through the garage door and glinting off the Mustang's polished chrome, when I realized I hadn't laughed in days. I hadn't eaten properly in a while, just coffee, snacks, and the occasional sandwich, too tense to sit down. My friends had reached out, asking if I wanted to hang out, but I kept turning them down. I was consumed with the unfairness, the suffocating weight of being treated as unimportant. I hated it. I hated my family for it. And I hated myself for letting it affect me so much. One night, I drove aimlessly, the streets empty and the air sharp and cold. I parked by a small overlook, staring out over the city lights and thinking about my life. All those years of doing the right thing, of being polite, patient, responsible, did it mean anything at all? I realized that my self-worth had been defined by people who didn't care to notice me. And I made a decision in that moment, quiet but fierce. I wasn't going to wait for anyone's validation anymore. Not Mom, not Dad, not George. If I wanted recognition, I would earn it for myself, and I would make it undeniable. The next morning, I started small. I went back to my favorite local mechanic, the one who had helped me track down rare parts for the Mustang, and we began fine-tuning the engine, adjusting the suspension, adding subtle upgrades that would make the car not just a dream, but a statement. While I worked, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. My hands were greasy, my shirt stained, but with every twist of a wrench, every adjustment, I felt a sense of purpose building back inside me. I also began reconnecting with my friends, cautiously at first, meeting them for coffee or a late-night burger, talking about things that mattered to me, sharing stories I had always held back because my family had never seemed interested. And they listened. They celebrated my wins in ways my family never had. And though it wasn't the same as family acknowledgement, it was enough to remind me that I mattered, that my happiness didn't have to be dictated by the whims of people who refused to see me. Work became my next focus. I had a decent job, but it wasn't fulfilling. I realized that if I wanted to prove my worth, I needed to build something that couldn't be ignored. I started taking on extra projects, learning new skills, networking quietly, and setting goals that were entirely mine. And slowly, the sense of invisibility began to lift. I could feel it, confidence returning, determination sharpening, a quiet smile creeping onto my face as I thought about the future, not one dictated by family, but by me. But even as I started rebuilding, the family drama continued in the background, gnawing at me. Every post about George's soccer game, every casual mention of him at dinner parties, every congratulatory message they sent exclusively to him was a reminder that I had been sidelined my entire life. It stung, yes, but instead of letting it break me, I started storing it away, like kindling for a fire I knew I would eventually ignite. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every ignored text, each became fuel for a plan that was beginning to form in the back of my mind. One evening, While tuning the Mustang's engine late into the night, I caught a reflection of myself in the polished hood. I barely recognized the person staring back. Gone was the frustrated, overlooked older brother. In his place was someone alert, patient, and quietly calculating. I could feel the weight of the years of being dismissed, the sting of every ignored milestone, and it was no longer a weakness, it was ammunition. The idea of revenge didn't feel petty or cruel yet. It felt like justice. Not violence, not confrontation, but a subtle, undeniable demonstration of everything I had achieved despite their attempts to keep me small. I began documenting things quietly. The times my achievements had been ignored, the blatant favoritism toward George, even the minor betrayals that had accumulated over the years. Each note, each memory, felt like laying the foundation of something bigger. I started saving receipts, screenshots of texts, pictures of the car, all evidence that when I had tried to share my happiness, my family had chosen to dismiss me. The thought of confronting them directly still made me tense, but I realized that I didn't need to rely on confrontation to be seen. I just needed to be undeniable. Then came the turning point, small, almost innocuous, but powerful. I started posting subtle pictures of the Mustang online, sharing my accomplishments with a wider audience, without mentioning my family. Friends commented, strangers admired, and I felt an intoxicating rush. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for recognition from people who didn't care. I was creating a reality where my achievements couldn't be ignored, where my work, my dedication, and my dreams could be celebrated by anyone who valued them. And every time I got a like, a comment, a message celebrating the car, the spark of determination inside me grew stronger. Even so, my family remained oblivious. George continued his soccer tournaments. Mom still prioritized him, and Dad maintained his quiet dismissals. But I didn't let it shake me anymore. I realized that their ignorance had been a gift in disguise. If they had celebrated me, if they had acknowledged my success, I might have continued living in the background, relying on their approval, trapped in their expectations. But now, with their blind favoritism, I had the freedom to build my life on my own terms, fueled by my own validation. I began planning my next steps carefully, quietly imagining scenarios where my family would finally have to acknowledge me, but not on their terms. Not as a favor, not as a polite nod, but as an undeniable reality they couldn't ignore. I wasn't going to be petty, and I wasn't going to be loud. I was going to be strategic, patient, and, most importantly, successful on my own terms. And every time I thought about them, laughing over George's latest win or rolling their eyes at my accomplishments, I felt a calm determination settle in my chest. The Mustang sat in the garage, gleaming under the lights, a symbol of everything I had fought for and everything I was about to take back. And as I polished the hood one late night, alone except for the quiet hum of the engine, I realized the truth. I was no longer the overlooked brother. I was Nathan. And soon, very soon, they were going to see me, not the shadow they had always assumed I would be, but the person I had built from years of being ignored, dismissed, and underestimated. For the first time, I didn't feel angry in the destructive way I used to. I felt focused, calm, powerful, and as I stepped back, hands covered in grease, staring at the car that had been my dream, I whispered to myself, they'll regret underestimating me. One day, they're going to understand exactly who Nathan is. And with that thought, I finally felt a sense of purpose I hadn't known for years. The quiet rebuilding had begun. I wasn't just recovering from their favoritism. I was preparing for the moment they would finally pay attention. But I knew it wouldn't be quick, and I knew it would require patience. The fire inside me was growing, and when it finally erupted, it wouldn't just be about the car. It would be about everything. By the time the following week rolled around, I felt different, more alert, more intentional, and strangely calm. The emotional storm of the past few days had settled into a sharp focus. I wasn't going to waste my energy stewing in anger anymore. That was childish, unproductive. What I needed was strategy, subtlety, and patience. I had the Mustang, I had my life, and I had the motivation to make my family notice me in a way they would never forget. I started small, with observations. Every interaction I had with my family over the years began to replay in my mind like a movie I had been forced to watch without speaking lines. I cataloged their behaviors. Mom's soft, manipulative tone whenever she wanted George to feel special. Dad's polite dismissal of my achievements. George's casual cruelty and smugness, always masked as humor. Every slight, every condescending word, every ignored accomplishment was a piece of the puzzle. I wasn't planning to confront them with anger. I was planning to craft a scenario so precise, so undeniable, that their own actions would unravel before them. The first step was timing. I needed the perfect moment when they would be most vulnerable to the sting of their own entitlement. I remembered George's big end-of-season soccer banquet. Everyone would be there, Mom and Dad included, eager to celebrate their golden child. It was perfect, a public setting, a captive audience, and the ideal opportunity to make my presence and my success unignorable. But I didn't just want to show up. I wanted them to feel the impact of their own neglect. I also started thinking about allies. I had friends who had quietly cheered me on for years, people who understood the history, the favoritism, the dismissals. They weren't just witnesses. They were a support system I could lean on. I reached out individually, telling them I had something important coming up, something that would finally make my family recognize my worth. I didn't give details, just enough to pique curiosity, and they were immediately on board. Knowing that people I trusted would be there, not to celebrate George but to see me succeed, gave me a strange sense of power. I had been invisible to my family for too long, but this time, the stage would be mine. Meanwhile, I began refining the Mustang, turning it into more than just a car. I added subtle but impressive upgrades, a perfectly tuned exhaust system, a restored interior with hidden modern touches, and a few custom details that made it unmistakably mine. Every tweak was intentional. I wasn't showing off. I was creating undeniable proof of my dedication, my taste, and my capability. The car had always been a dream, but now it was a tool in my plan. I also began dropping small hints in conversation, casual mentions of recent achievements, subtle reminders that I had a life beyond George's shadow. When Mom asked if I'd like to join for dinner, I would casually mention an early meeting or a project I was working on. Nothing overt, just enough to make them aware that I had been building a life independent of their attention, a life they couldn't control or define. The responses were predictable. Mom raised an eyebrow, Dad nodded absently, and George shrugged with his typical smugness. But it was exactly what I wanted. They were dismissing me, underestimating me, and in their arrogance, they didn't realize that every move I was making was a step toward a reckoning. One afternoon, I decided to test the waters further. I sent a text to Mom. "Hey, I'll be driving the Mustang by the park today around 5 p.m. Thought you might like to see it." I watched my phone like a hawk, anticipating her reply. Minutes passed. 10 minutes. 15. Nothing. It wasn't a surprise. She didn't reply, not because she was busy, but because she didn't think it mattered. I smiled quietly, because her lack of response only reinforced my plan. Patience was key. If she had replied, it would have ruined the tension, diluted the eventual impact. As the days passed, I began mapping out the social dynamics of the banquet. I made mental notes of who would be there, who would be watching George, and who might notice me if I did something unexpected. I didn't need the world to watch me. I needed the right people in the right place. I thought about the subtle satisfaction of their realization when they saw, for the first time in decades, that their attentions had been misplaced, that they had ignored someone capable, driven, and deserving of recognition. The image of Mom's shocked face, Dad's forced smile, and George's bewildered expression became a kind of fuel for me. Meanwhile, I continued to polish the Mustang, each gleam of red reflecting my focus and determination. The garage became my sanctuary and my strategy room. I spent hours planning not just what I would do, but how I would do it. This wasn't going to be a tantrum or an emotional outburst. It had to be precise, calm, and undeniable. Every detail mattered: the timing, the setting, the optics, the audience, and the emotional impact on my family. I imagined the scene repeatedly, playing out every possible reaction, tweaking the plan, and preparing for contingencies. I also began documenting everything meticulously. Photos of the car, receipts from rare parts, evidence of the countless hours I had spent restoring it. Screenshots of texts and social media posts that highlighted George's privileges versus my own efforts. Every slight, every moment of favoritism, every ignored achievement became part of an unshakable narrative. It wasn't about punishment, it was about proof. Proof that I had been dismissed, undervalued, and overlooked, and that I had succeeded despite it all. The more I worked, the more I realized that my plan wasn't just about the car or even about recognition. It was about reclaiming my life. For too long, I had allowed my family's narrow view of me to define my happiness. Now, I wasn't just building a scenario to make them notice me. I was building myself up in ways they couldn't touch, couldn't diminish, couldn't dismiss. The Mustang was the catalyst, the public stage was the setting, but the real power lay in the quiet, meticulous accumulation of everything they had ignored. By the night before the banquet, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The Mustang gleamed under the garage lights, my notes and plans were organized, and my friends were ready, intrigued but sworn to secrecy. I could feel the tension in my chest, but it wasn't anxiety anymore. It was anticipation. Every slight, every overlooked milestone, every dismissive word had been stored, cataloged, and transformed into a deliberate, patient strategy. The family's entitlement and arrogance had done the work for me. They had built the stage, and all I needed to do was step onto it. As I looked at my reflection in the hood one last time that night, I realized the truth. I wasn't seeking revenge out of malice. I wasn't trying to humiliate them for petty satisfaction. I was reclaiming something that had been denied to me for decades: acknowledgement, respect, and the validation of my own hard work. The Mustang wasn't just a car anymore. It was the symbol of everything I had endured and everything I was about to achieve. I parked it carefully in the garage, closed the door, and sat in the quiet darkness for a while, listening to the hum of the engine settle. Tomorrow, everything would change. My family would finally have to confront the reality they had ignored for years. And when that moment came, they wouldn't just see a car. They would see me. Not the background character they had cast me as, not the invisible older brother. They would see Nathan, fully realized, undeniably successful, and finally impossible to overlook. And somewhere deep in the pit of my chest, a small, dangerous thrill began to rise. The anticipation, the planning, the waiting, it all made the eventual moment that much sweeter. They didn't know it yet, but their carefully curated world of favoritism, entitlement, and attention had left a void, and I was about to fill it with something they would never forget. The day of the banquet arrived, and I felt an unusual serenity as I prepared. I dressed in a way that was subtle but noticeable: a sharp blazer, pressed slacks, and shoes polished to a mirror shine. No one could accuse me of trying too hard. Instead, I looked confident, composed, and undeniably in control. The Mustang gleamed in the driveway, perfectly positioned so that anyone arriving would see it first, its polished cherry red finish reflecting the morning sun. Every detail had been planned to maximize impact without a word being spoken. As I drove to the banquet, I felt a calm satisfaction. The engine's purr seemed to echo my heartbeat, steady, controlled, and unyielding. I had waited for this moment for years, meticulously preparing while my family continued to dismiss and underestimate me. Now, the scene was perfectly set, and all that remained was execution. I parked a few feet from the entrance, ensuring that everyone who mattered, Mom, Dad, George, and even the peripheral crowd of friends and neighbors, would notice the car as they arrived. The first reaction was exactly what I had imagined. The moment the banquet doors opened, Mom's jaw dropped, her eyes widening as she saw the Mustang. Her hand flew to her mouth, a gesture of surprise, but it was laced with something else, something I recognized immediately: realization. Dad's face turned pale, a tight-lipped expression replacing his usual polite detachment. And George froze, his smug smile fading as he took in the vehicle. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. It was perfect. I stepped out of the car, calm and composed, and adjusted my blazer. I didn't rush to speak. I let them take in the scene, let the weight of their own neglect settle around them. Every passing second added to the tension, and I felt a quiet thrill knowing that years of being ignored were finally paying off. The guests whispered among themselves, admiration evident in their tones, while my family looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, I walked into the banquet hall. I didn't rush to George or my parents. Instead, I moved with purpose, greeting friends and distant relatives who had noticed the car, subtly letting them admire the vehicle. "Thanks. It's been a labor of love," I said casually, letting the phrase hang in the air. It was understated but unmistakable. This was mine, achieved through my effort, and no one could take that away. Mom tried to intervene, her voice sharp but hesitant. "Nathan, you shouldn't. This is George's night. He should be the center of attention." I smiled faintly, calmly, letting the words wash over me. "I know, and I wouldn't want to steal the spotlight. I just thought it would be nice for everyone to see a little proof of hard work paying off." My tone was polite, measured, but each word carried the weight of years of overlooked effort. Dad attempted to mitigate, stepping in with his usual polite detachment. "Nathan, maybe we should focus on George. You know how excited he is." I held his gaze for a moment, steady and unwavering. "I understand. But isn't it interesting how sometimes attention and praise are given based on favoritism rather than achievement? Perhaps it's a conversation worth having." The subtle jab hit harder than any raised voice could have. George, still frozen, finally managed a stammered protest. But, I mean, everyone's here for me." I tilted my head, smiling, letting the silence hang. "Of course, but it seems they're also here for this." I gestured casually to the Mustang, parked just outside, perfectly visible through the large glass windows. "You know, something that I worked for years to build, something that reflects dedication, patience, and effort. Funny how that tends to get overlooked when there's a favorite in the family." The room went quiet, guests exchanging glances, whispers growing. My family's forced smiles tightened, their discomfort palpable. Mom's hand shook slightly as she sipped her drink. Dad's polite detachment faltered into visible embarrassment. George's face flushed a deep red, a mix of anger and shame. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was devastating. Every ounce of entitlement, every casual dismissal, every overlooked moment was now mirrored back at them through my calm, controlled presence. I let the moment breathe, taking a seat at a table near the center, casually opening a folder I had brought. It contained photos, receipts, social media screenshots, all proof of my hard work, the Mustang restoration process, and the countless times my family had ignored my milestones. I began casually sharing them with the guests seated nearby, people nodding, commenting, and visibly impressed. My family watched in silence, the realization settling in that I had quietly constructed an undeniable narrative. Nathan had succeeded, independently, and they had done nothing but ignore it. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere had shifted completely. George's friends still cheered him on, but it was subdued, overshadowed by whispers about the car and the achievement behind it. Mom and Dad sat side by side. Their earlier composure cracked as I walked past, holding conversations, accepting congratulations, and letting the recognition flow freely to me without demanding it. For the first time in my life, they couldn't diminish what I had built. They couldn't claim attention, couldn't redirect praise, couldn't rewrite history. I had reclaimed my narrative, and they were forced to witness it. When the banquet ended, I returned to the Mustang one last time that night. I ran my hand over the polished hood, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers. The car gleamed under the streetlights, a mirror reflecting not just its own shine, but the culmination of years of patience, effort, and resilience. I had done more than just show them a car. I had shown them me. Every slight, every dismissal, every overlooked moment had been transformed into a quiet, undeniable triumph. Mom tried one last time, her voice trembling, soft, almost pleading. "Nathan, maybe we should talk tomorrow." I smiled, a calm, final smile, and shook my head gently. "We can talk. But for now, let's just acknowledge that sometimes recognition doesn't come when you want it. Sometimes it comes when you've earned it, whether people notice or not." Dad muttered something under his breath, awkwardly, unable to find a way to reclaim authority. George turned away, avoiding my eyes, and I could see the shift in him, a mixture of envy, frustration, and disbelief. They had no words left. They had no deflection. They had no excuses. For the first time, I wasn't just seen. I was respected, acknowledged, and celebrated on my own terms. Driving home later that night, the Mustang purring beneath me, I felt an extraordinary calm. The long years of invisibility, the frustration, the resentment, they had all culminated in this moment. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had validation in the form of achievement, independence, and a hard-earned victory that no one could take away. I had built my own world, on my own terms, and they were mere spectators. As I pulled into my driveway, the garage lights reflecting the deep red of the Mustang, I parked and leaned back in the driver's seat one last time. I looked at my reflection in the windshield and whispered to myself, softly but firmly, I'm done being invisible. Nathan has arrived. And this time, they can't ignore me. For the first time in decades, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge as much as it was about reclaiming what had always been mine: respect, acknowledgement, and the quiet but undeniable proof that I mattered. And as I stepped out of the car, shutting the door with a soft, final click, I knew that nothing, and no one, would ever make me feel invisible again. I'm Matthew, 28, and I've spent most of my life trying to keep the peace with my family, only to realize the harder I tried, the more they expected. My parents divorced when I was 12, leaving my siblings, 3 older, 1 younger, and me to navigate a minefield of favoritism and passive-aggressive competition. Growing up, I was always too sensitive or overreacting when I pointed out something unfair, while my older brother, Ryan, got away with practically everything because, according to my parents, he was the ambitious one. My cousin, Elena, always took Ryan's side, sometimes joining in just to see how far she could push me. Over the years, I learned to bite my tongue, nod, and smile, even when they mocked my choices or downplayed my accomplishments. It was exhausting, but it kept the peace, or at least that's what I thought. Recently, my life started changing in ways they couldn't touch. I'd quietly build a side business that started as a hobby, but had grown into something substantial. Not flashy, not public, just quietly making me more independent than I'd ever been before. I didn't flaunt it, didn't talk about it. I didn't need their approval. But apparently, silence wasn't enough. A few nights ago, I got tagged in our family group chat. It was one of those long threads where my siblings try to connect, but end up sounding like a courtroom of judgment. My sister, Olivia, opened the discussion with what she thought was sage advice. Matt, it's time you let go of everything. Stop overthinking and just move on. Pretty typical, but it felt sharp, like a polite jab disguised as care. Then Ryan chimed in all caps, yes. Let it go, Matt. For real. I sighed, expecting the usual stop being so dramatic lecture. But it was my cousin Elena's next message that made my stomach drop. Good luck with that. You'll see why in a minute. I stared at the chat for a while, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Normally, I'd just scroll past, ignore it, let them dig their own hole. But something in me snapped. Maybe it was the way they all assumed they could control me, tell me to step aside while they live their lives free of consequences. Maybe it was how no one ever bothered to see the real effort I'd put into making something of myself. Maybe it was just late, and I was tired of pretending. So, I typed back. Fine. I'll step back. By 2 a.m., my phone blew up. 80 missed calls from my siblings and a series of frantic texts from Ryan. Matthew, what have you done? Answer me now. You can't just... I didn't answer. I simply texted back once, calmly. I did exactly what you wanted. That's when the first real panic hit them. I should probably back up and explain what stepping back actually meant. For years, I'd been quietly managing an inheritance that my late grandfather had left to me, held in trust until I turned 28. Everyone knew about it, but they assumed it was a figurehead kind of account, something I'd never touch seriously. They assumed I'd keep it dormant while they continued their petty squabbles and passive-aggressive competitions. The truth? I had been managing it wisely, growing it quietly, while they spent every family gathering assuming I was too naive or reckless to make anything of it. The irony was intoxicating. When I decided to step back, I wasn't giving up. I was finally putting myself first in a way they would notice. The first step was subtle, almost invisible. I transferred a significant portion of assets into accounts that only I could access, restructuring everything to ensure no one could touch it without my knowledge. I made sure every step was legally airtight. It was the kind of move that, on paper, looked like compliance, but in reality, it was a slow, precise cut of the power they assumed they had over me. The calls and texts came in waves. At first, it was Ryan, frantic, begging, trying to sound rational. "Matt, don't do this. We're family. You can't just lock us out." Then Olivia and my youngest sibling, Jake, started pleading. Even my parents got involved, each sending carefully worded messages that were basically veiled guilt trips. My cousin Elena, though, took a different approach. She didn't beg. She laughed, sent a single message. "Well, looks like someone finally learned how to play." I watched it all unfold from my kitchen, sitting at the table with my laptop open, a mug of cold coffee at my side. There was a strange mix of dread and satisfaction twisting in my chest. Part of me worried about how far I'd have to take this, how much I'd have to reveal to make them understand. Part of me felt a strange thrill in seeing them realize they weren't in control anymore. All those years of subtle insults, of being sidelined, of having my ambitions minimized, they thought it was invisible. But I had been watching, waiting, planning. And now the moment had come when the first domino could fall. Even now, as I type this, I can see how the smallest misstep could make things explode completely. Ryan has a temper that only escalates when he feels powerless. Olivia, the so-called voice of reason, tends to weaponize guilt in a way that makes your head spin. Jake just parrots everyone else, and Elena, well, she thrives on chaos. I know that if I let my guard down, they'll swarm. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I was anticipating. By 3 a.m., I had their attention fully. They were desperate, frantic, and yet, I hadn't said a word beyond that one calm line. I did exactly what you wanted. What they didn't know, what none of them realized, was that this was just the beginning. Every move I had made in the last few years, the silent growth of my business, the careful handling of money, the strategic decisions to step back and let them underestimate me, they all led to this moment. And now that moment was here. I sat back, watched the phone light up, and for the first time, felt completely untethered from their expectations. Their panic, their anger, their disbelief, it was all delicious in its way. I wasn't the naive Matthew they thought I was. I wasn't the kid who would quietly take the abuse or shrug off their manipulations. I had power now, and they didn't even know the half of it. Somewhere in the middle of all the chaos, I thought about my own doubts. Was this the right move? Was I overstepping? But then I reminded myself of the countless times I had been dismissed, ignored, or undermined. This wasn't just about money or control. It was about finally showing them who I really was. About claiming the respect I had never been given. And yes, part of me relished the idea that they would realize just how wrong they'd been about me. As dawn approached, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The family that had always tried to control me, manipulate me, and belittle me now had no idea how much I had been holding back, or what I was capable of. And while they were panicking, I was calm. I was ready, and I was just getting started. After that night, the dynamic in the family shifted immediately, though I don't think they realized it at first. The panic in their messages had barely subsided before they started trying to reassert themselves, each in their own way. Ryan, of course, led the charge, calling me nonstop, alternating between threats and fake concern. "Matthew, don't make this harder than it has to be," he said at one point, his voice tight with frustration. "We can work this out." I could hear the judgment dripping from every syllable, the assumption that I would cave because I always had in the past. But I stayed silent. I let him run out of breath. I had learned long ago that speaking first gave them an advantage, and this time, I wasn't giving them one. Olivia, meanwhile, tried a different tactic. She sent long, almost poetic messages in the group chat, filled with guilt and vague platitudes. "We've always tried to support you, Matt, but you make it so difficult. Don't throw away family for what? Pride? Ego?" She even called me several times, crying on the phone, trying to make me feel like the villain. I listened quietly, as if I were a neutral party, not the person they had just spent decades undermining. Inside, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. These were the same people who, for years, had dismissed every accomplishment, mocked every effort, and made me feel like nothing I did could ever matter. Now they were shocked that I could make a move they didn't control. But the breaking point came later that week during our monthly family gathering, the kind of event that had always felt like walking into a minefield. They had rented a large cabin outside the city, and I went thinking I could maintain my composure. I had carefully planned my arrival, timing it so I could observe and gather information without giving away my own hand. My goal wasn't confrontation, at least not yet. I wanted to watch, to see how far their arrogance could push them before the consequences of underestimating me became undeniable. As soon as I walked in, I could feel the shift. My siblings had been whispering, glancing at me like I was a puzzle they couldn't solve. Ryan was the first to speak. "Matt," he said, voice low but sharp. "Sit down. Let's talk." I smiled politely, nodded, and took a seat, careful to keep my body language neutral. Olivia sat across from me, trying to look calm, but I noticed the tension in her jaw. Jake hovered nearby, bouncing nervously between them. Elena, of course, sat on the couch, smirking, arms crossed, as if she were waiting for a performance she was certain I would give. The first half hour passed in strained silence, punctuated by small talk and pointed compliments that didn't feel sincere. I could see the favoritism dripping from every interaction. Ryan was treated like the golden child, every joke landing, every story met with laughter, while my comments were interrupted, dismissed, or ignored. Olivia kept redirecting the conversation to achievements that had nothing to do with me, subtly undermining my presence. And Elena, she was worse. She would lean over and whisper things to Ryan that were just loud enough for me to hear. "Do you really think he's capable of handling this? He's always been reckless." It stung, but I bit back the urge to respond. Letting them underestimate me was part of the strategy. Things came to a head after dinner. I had noticed, throughout the evening, that my siblings were taking care to make me feel excluded, details that were small but symbolic. They all shared a toast for Ryan's latest promotion, a victory he had achieved with their support, yet they didn't even acknowledge my business successes. They laughed at inside jokes I wasn't part of, and whenever I tried to contribute, someone, usually Ryan or Elena, would interrupt with a condescending comment. Finally, I excused myself and went out to the porch for some air. The cold night felt like a reprieve from the constant tension inside. I was halfway through a text to a friend, trying to calm my mind, when I heard Ryan's voice behind me. "You think you can just step back and play it your way?" he asked, sharp and accusing. I turned slowly, keeping my tone calm. "I'm just doing what I need to do," I said. He shook his head, disbelief twisting his expression. "This isn't about you, Matthew. This is family. You don't get to make these choices alone." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, then said softly, "I've been making choices for myself my whole life. It's just taken me a while to make them visible to you." He froze, eyes narrowing, as if the calmness in my voice was more threatening than any shout or insult. The real shock came a few minutes later when I returned to the living room. Elena had moved closer to Ryan, whispering in his ear. I didn't catch every word, but the tone was unmistakable. She was plotting, scheming, feeding his panic. But it wasn't just their manipulation that hit me. It was the betrayal from Olivia. She leaned toward Ryan and said something that stopped my heart. "We can't let him ruin this for us. He doesn't deserve the trust Grandpa left him. It's ours too, and he's never going to be responsible enough." I blinked. For a moment, I couldn't process it. Olivia, my sister, who I had assumed would at least try to mediate, was actively conspiring to take what I had been entrusted with. I wanted to scream, to confront her, but I stayed calm, masking the surge of anger and hurt. I realized then that nothing I had done would ever satisfy them. Their favoritism wasn't just a pattern, it was a principle, a lens through which they measured everything I did. And for them, I could never be the responsible one. I could never be the good sibling. I was always the outsider, the target, the one to blame. That night, I returned home feeling a mix of rage, heartbreak, and clarity. For years, I had tiptoed around their expectations, trying to prove myself in ways that were never enough. I had tolerated their manipulations, tried to maintain the fragile peace, and hoped that one day they'd recognize my worth. But now it was undeniable. They didn't care about fairness. They didn't care about truth. They cared only about control, about maintaining their narrative that I was lesser, incapable, and ultimately dispensable. I sat in my apartment, and reviewed every decision I had made in the last few years, every quiet investment, every careful plan, every step I had taken to secure my independence. And for the first time, I allowed myself to fully embrace the idea that I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was preparing for the moment when they would finally understand the consequences of underestimating me. But that clarity came with a cost. I realized that this family, the people I had loved and trusted, had crossed a line. Their betrayal wasn't subtle. It was a full-scale attack on my character and my life. I knew that from this point on, nothing would ever be the same. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. And while I was building my strategy, waiting for the perfect moment, I couldn't ignore the simmering dread that one misstep on their part, or mine, could ignite chaos the likes of which none of us had seen before. By the end of that week, I had tightened my plan, ready to step into the confrontation they had unwittingly invited. I watched the group chat with meticulous attention, noting the cracks in their confidence, the panic in their texts, the desperation that was becoming almost palpable. I could see the shifting alliances forming in real time. Ryan growing frantic, Olivia hesitating, Elena trying to fan the flames while masking her own fear. And I sat back, feeling that rare, intoxicating mix of anticipation and vindication. The breaking point had arrived, though they didn't know it yet. They had assumed I would bow, I would give in, I would play along and accept their judgment as truth. But I had learned. I had planned. And the next time they tried to corner me, to manipulate me, to take what was mine, they were going to realize that Matthew wasn't the same kid they had always underestimated. I wasn't just stepping back anymore. I was about to step forward in a way they would never see coming. After the betrayal at the family gathering, I felt like I'd hit a wall I didn't think I could climb. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, feeling a hollow emptiness settle in my chest. It wasn't just the shock of what Olivia had said. It was the accumulation of years of being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. For the first time in my life, the weight of their expectations, judgments, and favoritism felt almost unbearable. I had always thought I could manage it, compartmentalize it, and move forward, but the betrayal made it real. My own family had actively conspired to undermine me, and they did it without a second thought. For days, I avoided the group chat, muted calls, and even ignored emails from my siblings and my parents. I needed space, time to breathe, and, more importantly, time to process. Their messages kept coming, frantic and increasingly desperate. Ryan sent a video message that started calm and ended in near shouting, demanding that I meet him in person. Olivia sent paragraphs dripping with guilt, trying to frame me as the antagonist in some narrative only she could see. Even Jake, usually silent, sent emojis that carried the weight of passive judgment. I didn't respond. I let the messages pile up, watched the notifications grow into a virtual mountain that I refused to climb. I felt the sting of isolation, not just from my family, but from the realization that I had carried the emotional labor for years. I tried to maintain peace, to smooth over conflicts, to hold everyone together while my own ambitions, successes, and feelings were quietly minimized. Now, confronted with the full extent of their entitlement and cruelty, I felt both despair and clarity. I had two options: continue to be swallowed by their drama, or finally step into the life I had been building in secret. I chose the latter. The first step was practical. I dove back into my business, the one I had nurtured quietly for years, and threw myself into work with a focus I had never allowed before. For so long, I had been splitting my energy between appeasing them and managing my responsibilities. Now, every ounce of effort went into building something that was mine entirely, something they couldn't touch, criticize, or diminish. I worked late nights, refining strategies, expanding investments, quietly acquiring contacts that would later become vital. I started outsourcing and delegating, growing the scope of the business beyond what anyone in the family could imagine. Alongside the work, I focused on myself in ways I had neglected. I started exercising consistently, not for vanity, but for discipline and mental clarity. I took long walks in the early mornings, letting the quiet streets clear my mind, replaying conversations and analyzing their patterns of manipulation. I journaled, pouring my thoughts onto paper, untangling years of resentment, frustration, and sadness. The act of writing became a therapy in itself, allowing me to see the patterns of their behavior clearly and recognize how I had been conditioned to internalize blame. As the weeks passed, I noticed subtle shifts in my own mindset. I wasn't just recovering from their betrayal. I was learning to redefine myself on my own terms. I stopped comparing myself to Ryan's achievements, Olivia's approvals, or Elena's constant scheming. I realized that my worth wasn't determined by their acknowledgement, but by the tangible results of my own effort, the integrity of my decisions, and the satisfaction of pursuing goals that aligned with my values. Slowly, I began to feel the first glimmers of empowerment I had ever experienced. Then came the first tangible sign of rise. A major client unexpectedly contacted me, interested in a long-term partnership. It was one of those opportunities that could catapult a business forward, the kind that usually goes to people with a visible reputation or family connections. I didn't have either publicly, but my preparation, discipline, and careful growth had positioned me perfectly to seize it. I spent days negotiating, planning, and securing the deal, quietly celebrating the win that my family would have scoffed at if they knew. The thrill wasn't just financial, it was symbolic. It was proof that I didn't need their approval or interference to succeed. I could thrive independently. During this period, I started noticing how their panic had shifted. Messages in the family group chat became more frequent, but laced with frustration. Ryan sent increasingly desperate attempts at manipulation, phrases like, "You're making a huge mistake," and "We need to talk before it's too late," but they lacked the authority they once had. Olivia oscillated between pleading and subtle threats, attempting guilt without substance, while Elena's smirky commentary turned more defensive, almost frantic. I didn't respond, but I observed. Every message, every tone, every delayed reply told me they were starting to realize that their assumptions about me were wrong. They were unsteady, uncertain, and, for the first time, fearful. It was during one of these quiet weeks that I discovered another layer of leverage. While reviewing some of the older financial documents from the trust my grandfather had left me, I realized there were clauses and details that my family had overlooked or assumed I didn't understand. Certain permissions required unanimous family approval, and some opportunities for mismanagement were only possible if I had been reckless, which I hadn't been. In other words, every attempt they might make to claim or influence the inheritance could be legally neutralized, leaving me fully in control. The realization gave me a calm, calculated confidence. I wasn't just prepared to rise. I was prepared to ensure that any move they made could be anticipated and countered. Even more importantly, I started reconnecting with friends and contacts who had been quiet supporters throughout my life. People who had recognized my abilities, my work ethic, and my potential. Their encouragement, advice, and practical assistance reinforced my sense of self-worth. I realized that success wasn't only about financial gain. It was about cultivating a network of genuine allies who respected me for who I was, not what they assumed I could or couldn't do. The contrast with my family's entitlement became sharper by the day. Emotionally, I felt a strange mix of healing and anticipation. I was still hurt, still processing the sting of betrayal, but that pain had become fuel rather than an anchor. I started imagining scenarios in which I could confront their assumptions, in which I could finally show them the reality of my independence. Each potential action was carefully measured, designed not just for impact but for precision. Every move was part of a larger strategy, one that had been years in the making without their knowledge. But the rise didn't mean it was smooth. There were moments of self-doubt, nights when I questioned whether I was overreacting or letting resentment cloud my judgment. Sometimes, after long days of work and meticulous planning, I would glance at the family group chat and feel a pang of loneliness, realizing that, despite everything, I still cared about their approval in some deep, stubborn corner of my mind. I had to confront that honestly, reminding myself that true strength wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming control over my life and refusing to let them define my self-worth. As weeks turned into months, the contrast between my quiet, calculated rise and their frantic, chaotic attempts to regain control became more pronounced. I was calm, deliberate, and increasingly independent, while they grew erratic, desperate, and irrational. It was a delicate dance, one I observed from a distance, knowing that every misstep they made would only make the eventual confrontation more potent. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place unexpectedly. While attending a business seminar, I networked with a financial advisor who specialized in estate planning and high-level investments. In the course of conversation, I realized there were opportunities to secure and grow my assets even further, opportunities that my family could never interfere with unless I chose to let them. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about freedom, leverage, and the undeniable proof that I had quietly outgrown the roles they had assigned me. Sitting in my apartment that evening, reflecting on everything, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. I had fallen to the lowest emotional point in my life, but I had also risen stronger, smarter, and more capable than I had ever been. The family that had spent years underestimating me, controlling me, and attempting to manipulate me was beginning to realize that their assumptions no longer held power. I had discovered my own strength, my own independence, and the quiet thrill of building something that was entirely mine. And yet, even in the midst of this rise, I knew the storm wasn't over. The next phase would require patience, precision, and timing. I would need to push just enough to make them understand, without tipping my hand too early. The stakes were higher than ever, the tension palpable, and the potential for chaos enormous. But for the first time in my life, I was ready to face it on my terms. I wasn't the Matthew they thought they knew. I was stronger, sharper, and prepared for the moment when everything they assumed about me would unravel. The breaking point had passed, the rise had begun, and the fall of their assumptions, their entitlement, and their false sense of control was only a matter of time. By the time I decided to act, everything had changed, not externally, but internally. I wasn't reacting out of anger anymore. I was planning. Every text, every conversation, every meeting with my family could now be anticipated and turned into an advantage. I had rebuilt my life, my business, and my self-worth. And now it was time to consider the moment when I would let them see just how wrong they had been about me for all these years. The thrill wasn't in immediate retaliation. It was in the meticulous setup, the slow tightening of a web that would leave them with no room to maneuver. The first step was gathering information. For years, I had collected the subtle clues they left behind. The way Ryan bragged about investments he didn't fully understand, the little asides Olivia made about what they deserved, the gossip Elena spread whenever she thought I wasn't listening. Now, with my business growing and my financial independence firmly established, I had the resources to dig deeper without them suspecting. I reviewed old trust documents, investment records, and family business dealings. I discovered every vulnerability, every assumption, and every blind spot they relied on to maintain their sense of superiority. Each discovery added fuel to my growing sense of calm control. While doing this, I also started reconnecting with allies I hadn't realized were quietly observing my growth. A former mentor reached out, a client offered advice and connections, and a few old friends who had quietly witnessed my perseverance became sounding boards for strategy. I realized I didn't need to rely on family approval. In fact, their opinion had never been relevant. Every conversation, every tip, every piece of insight from people who truly understood my capabilities added to the meticulous planning I was constructing. I was creating a foundation that could not be shaken. At the same time, I began testing the waters with my family, not in obvious ways, but subtly. I allowed Ryan to continue with his overconfidence, to make small mistakes while bragging about them. I let Olivia think her passive-aggressive guilt trips still had an effect, responding only with vague neutrality that frustrated her without giving her leverage. I even let Elena continue her small manipulations, observing her reactions, gauging how far she would push before showing her the limits of my patience. Every misstep they made was cataloged, every overreach noted, and every assumption they had about me was quietly being dismantled. The next stage was the business side of my plan. I had carefully structured my assets, both the trust and my independent ventures, so that any attempt to seize, manipulate, or challenge me would be legally and financially impossible without my consent. I created multiple layers of protection, hidden accounts, subtle transfers, and strategic partnerships that insulated me from interference while keeping the illusion of normalcy intact. To anyone who glanced, I was simply continuing life as usual, but in reality, I had built a fortress that would allow me to operate freely while they floundered. Then came the psychological setup. I knew that to truly shift the dynamic, I needed to make them believe they were still in control, while in fact, the power was in my hands. I began using the family group chat strategically, posting vague comments that implied uncertainty or hesitation on my part. Maybe I'll just let things sort themselves out, I typed one evening, careful to keep my tone casual. The effect was immediate. Ryan responded within minutes, panicked. Don't even think about it. You know we can work this out. Olivia sent a long essay about fairness and family, ending with a plea that I consider everyone else's feelings. Elena chimed in with a smirk, assuming she could still manipulate the situation. All the while, I said nothing more than, I'm thinking about it, letting them stew in their own fear and assumption. One of the most important parts of the setup was patience. I couldn't rush this. If I moved too quickly, I risked exposing my hand. So I spent weeks cultivating calm, quiet confidence, letting the tension build while they floundered. I observed patterns. When Ryan grew frustrated, when Olivia attempted emotional manipulation, when Elena tried to provoke me into reacting. Each pattern became a tool I could use later. By the time I made a move, it wouldn't be out of anger or impulse. It would be calculated, precise, and devastating in its effectiveness. Meanwhile, I quietly expanded my network beyond the family. I reached out to old contacts who had influence over business, law, and finance. People who could become allies if the situation escalated. I didn't reveal my plan, of course. I simply cultivated relationships, learning their strengths, their weaknesses, and the opportunities they might provide. By the time I was ready, I would have resources they couldn't even imagine existed. I began keeping detailed notes, spreadsheets, and contingency plans, mapping out every possible scenario and response. Every move they could make, every argument they might try, every manipulation they could attempt. I anticipated it all. The most important part of the setup, though, was my own mindset. I had to remain calm, unshakable, and focused. I could feel their energy beginning to shift. Text messages grew more frantic, comments more pointed, and casual interactions more tense. They were starting to sense that something was changing, though they couldn't pinpoint what. That uncertainty was key. I let them stew in it. Let them question. Let them argue among themselves. Let them project their fears onto one another. By the time they realized I wasn't the same Matthew they had always underestimated, it would be too late. One evening, as I reviewed my notes for the 100th time, I realized I was ready for the first real move. It wouldn't be overt, nothing dramatic yet, but it would test the waters, gauge their reactions, and begin the chain of events that would ultimately reveal the truth of my independence and capability. I sent a simple message in the family group chat. I've been reviewing a few things, and I think it's time I step back entirely for a while. The responses came almost immediately. Ryan called, panic clear in his voice. Olivia texted, pleading for clarification. Elena simply replied with, interesting. Can't wait to see how this plays out. I didn't respond beyond a casual, we'll see, letting them stew, letting their own assumptions tighten the cage they thought I was trapped in. I spent the next few days watching them unravel in small, almost imperceptible ways. Ryan tried to assert authority in ways that made him look desperate rather than powerful. Olivia attempted guilt trips that only reflected her own impatience and insecurity. Elena tried to manipulate behind the scenes, whispering to other relatives, all the while thinking she was in control. And through it all, I remained calm, collected, and untouchable, knowing that every move I had made in the last several months had positioned me perfectly for the moment when I would reveal what they had never considered, that I had been quietly building strength, independence, and power the entire time. The stage was set. Every misstep they made, every assumption they held about me, every attempt to regain control would now be part of the play I had been directing from the shadows. I had rebuilt my life, fortified my position, and created a web of influence and leverage that they couldn't touch. And as I looked at the notifications piling up on my phone, messages of panic, subtle threats, and desperate pleading, I felt a quiet thrill. They thought they were in control, but the truth was exactly the opposite. The next few weeks would be crucial. I would continue the slow, deliberate build-up, letting tension and anticipation grow until the moment was right. I had everything I needed: knowledge, power, resources, and patience. And most importantly, I had clarity. I knew exactly what I wanted to achieve, and I would do it without ever compromising my own standards or giving them the satisfaction of seeing me react out of emotion. They had underestimated me for decades, and now the stage was perfectly set for them to realize just how wrong they had been. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights through my window, and allowed myself a small, private smile. The setup was complete. The pieces were in place. And soon, very soon, the first domino would fall. The morning I decided to act, everything felt different. I woke up calm, unusually focused, with no trace of the old fear or self-doubt that had haunted me for years. Every step I had taken, the careful rebuilding of my business, the legal fortification of my assets, the strategic patience in watching my family flail, had led to this moment. The day wasn't about anger. It was about precision, about finally showing them the reality of what I had become and dismantling the illusions they had clung to for decades. The first move was subtle. I sent a message in the family group chat. I've finalized some updates. I'll be sharing details this evening at the family meeting. The responses were immediate, chaotic. Ryan called first, voice trembling with what I realized was fear rather than anger. "Matthew, what updates? What are you talking about?" He tried to sound casual, but I could hear the panic behind every word. Olivia followed with a flurry of texts, carefully worded to sound concerned and reasonable, while Elena, true to form, sent a cryptic, "This should be fun. Can't wait to see your move." I ignored the calls and texts, letting the tension simmer. I had prepared every document, every piece of evidence, every financial record that would be needed to show, unequivocally, how independent I was, and how utterly wrong they had been about me for all these years. The meeting was scheduled in the same cabin where their betrayal had cut me so deeply weeks ago. I arrived early, calm and collected, carrying a folder that felt heavier than it was. Inside were years of meticulous planning, financial records, contracts, and proof of every step I had taken to protect and grow what was legally mine. When they arrived, I noticed the subtle changes immediately. Ryan's posture was stiff, as if he expected a confrontation he couldn't control. Olivia's hands shook slightly as she clutched her notes, and Elena's smirk wavered, almost imperceptibly, replaced by a thin line of concern. They didn't realize it yet, but every one of them had underestimated how far I had gone, how carefully I had built the foundation for this exact moment. I started the meeting with deliberate calm. "I know some of you have been concerned about recent changes," I said, my voice steady. "So I thought it was time we went over everything together." I laid the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a series of spreadsheets, investment statements, and trust documents. Everything in here is transparent and legally sound. Every decision I've made, every step I've taken, has been within my rights and fully documented. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Ryan leaned forward, scanning the documents, his face slowly draining of color. Olivia's mouth opened, then closed, unable to formulate words quickly enough. Elena, usually quick with a sarcastic remark, froze, staring at the folder as if it were a bomb about to explode. I let the silence stretch, watching them flounder in disbelief. Then Ryan spoke, voice tight. You did all this without telling us." I nodded calmly. "Yes, I did exactly what I needed to do to protect myself and my interests. Something I've been capable of for a long time, as it turns out." His face twisted in a mixture of anger and panic. "But you can't just, this isn't fair." I leaned back slightly, letting the words land. Fair? Fairness would have been considering my effort, my growth, and my rights from the start. Instead, I was underestimated, ignored, and in some cases actively undermined. Now, you get to see the consequences of that underestimation. Olivia finally found her voice, her tone trembling. "Matthew, we thought." I cut her off, calm but firm. "You thought wrong. Every assumption you made about me, every time you assumed I wasn't capable, has been proven false. And now you have to face the reality that I am fully in control of my life and my resources, without your interference." Elena, sensing the tide had turned, Tried a different approach. Matthew, come on. This isn't necessary. We're family. We can't. I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Family doesn't get a free pass to undermine, manipulate, or dismiss me. What you've seen tonight isn't revenge in the emotional sense. It's accountability. You assumed I would remain quiet and malleable. That assumption is gone. Then came the part that truly crushed them. I revealed additional information they hadn't anticipated, strategic partnerships and legal arrangements that made any attempt to contest my control impossible. Every attempt they might make to seize influence over the trust, my business, or future investments was nullified. Their panic grew, visible in tense gestures, biting of lips, and whispered arguments among themselves. They realized that the years they had spent plotting, manipulating, and dismissing me had not only failed, they had inadvertently set me up for complete dominance. Ryan tried one last-ditch effort, leaning forward with a desperate edge in his voice. We just want what's fair. You don't need to. I shook my head slowly. Fairness isn't your right, Ryan. It's earned. And what I've earned has been the result of my work, my intelligence, and my patience, not your assumptions or interference. The difference between us is simple. I act on reality. You act on expectation. Olivia, tears in her eyes now, whispered something about forgiveness, about giving me a chance. I shook my head. Forgiveness isn't the issue. Recognition of reality is. You see now that underestimating me was a mistake. Understanding that is your first step. Elena, her voice quieter now, tried to salvage her pride. You're different than we thought. I let out a small, almost imperceptible smile. Yes, I am. And that's the result of being underestimated and having to prove myself quietly. I've grown while you were busy thinking you were in control. The fallout was immediate and absolute. Over the next weeks, the family dynamic shifted completely. Ryan's attempts to assert authority over me were met with calm refusal and legal boundaries. Olivia's guilt trips no longer carried weight. She had to face the consequences of having sided with manipulation rather than fairness. Elena, who had always thrived on chaos, realized that I now operated from a position she could not manipulate. Every attempt to regain influence only reinforced their own helplessness, cementing the finality of my rise. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The quiet, methodical execution of the plan did all the work. The knowledge that I had acted deliberately, strategically, and flawlessly was more satisfying than any dramatic display could have been. The realization in their eyes, the sudden loss of assumed power, and the complete recalibration of how they had to treat me from that moment forward, that was the victory. Months later, the family gatherings felt different. They were cordial, careful, and respectful, though I never allowed familiarity to blur the lines I had drawn. My business thrived, my independence solidified, and I finally experienced the quiet satisfaction of walking into a room without the fear of being diminished. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my future on my own terms. And the final, private moment of satisfaction came late one evening, as I reviewed everything from my apartment, looking at the city lights through the window. I thought about all the years I had been underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed. I thought about the quiet work, the careful planning, the patient observation. And I realized something fundamental. The true power wasn't in revenge itself. It was in the clarity, the control, and the knowledge that I had built something so strong that no one, not even my own family, could ever undermine it again. I leaned back, a smile spreading slowly across my face, and whispered to myself, they finally see. I've been in control all along.